All right. Is this happening? Yes. Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder, one of the co-founders of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division in New York City. We've been around since 2012. My partner, Donnie Jochum, and I started this, and we've been at the LGBT Community Center since 2014. So I was so happy that Dan contacted us through Vicky No in Chicago. Thank you, Vicky. Great connections, bringing people together across the pond. And we are so glad that this is happening, even if it is online. It's a way for us to connect. So we've been closed since March 13th, as the center has been closed since then. And still not sure when the reopening is going to be, probably looking like October. But in the meantime, we're going to keep holding some virtual events, and we're still doing book orders online if people email us. So please stay in touch with us. And I'm sure we'll be adding more events throughout the summer as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Dan, and we're going to get started on this virtual book launch of United Queerdom. And please give a warm, silent welcome to Dan Glass.
Oh, thank you everyone for having us. Just before I go into the reading, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Vicky for putting us in touch with Greg, to Sarah, to Jason, to Sunitha, to Stuart, and all of our speakers for tonight, which we'll introduce fully. I just wanted to give a tiny bit of context. For me to be even on a virtual event with the LGBT Community Center in New York is so surreal. I can't tell you. I've watched United in Anger with Andrea and other activists in London here probably about 300 times, up and down the UK. Since we reformed ACT UP in 2014, I think it was. And just those scenes in the New York LGBT Center, like with the pillars, the way that everyone sat on the floor, it's just surreal to be able to be virtually connected with you, because ACT UP and the Gay Liberation Front and civil rights movements across America, I've learned so much from. And in this day and age, in this political climate, we need to have these conversations about creative, powerful, revolutionary strategies for social change. And that's really going to be the focus of tonight, in terms of how can we pay tribute to the legacy of Stuart and others from and Nettie and others from the Gay Liberation Front, who started Pride here in the UK with the aim of absolute freedom for all. So it's a real honor to be with everyone tonight, and hopefully one day we'll actually be with you in person. I know that Bryn and others from ACT UP New York, we've been having these conversations for years now about actually getting to America, but I don't think the immigration services like me very much. Part of the book says why. One action which I got a 10-year ban from America was when I superglued Gordon Brown 13 years ago as part of a climate change protest. That was a 10-year ban. Then that was ended in 2018. And then I was lucky to be, you know, the big baby Trump blimp, the big baby Trump. I was lucky to, my friends helped make that, and I was one of the Trump babysitters. And then I got another 2-year ban. So yeah, I don't know if I'll ever be with you, but one day, hopefully I'll be with you in person, and I'll cry my eyes out when I get to the New York LGBT Center. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'm gonna read the section which I tried to incorporate as many of the speakers that we have here tonight. Just one last big thank you to Sarah for Sarah came to London, when was it? Sometime last year, and we did a whole series of events around queer, ACT UP, intersectional activism. And you gave me a bit of advice that really helped through the whole writing process, which has been 2 years, which it was, I'm not going to do your exact words justice, but I was like, what's your tips for writing? Because you're such one of my most inspirational writers, as is Stuart. And you said, if you're in your room and if you feel yourself going bananas and you're talking to yourself and you're completely down the rabbit hole, that's a good sign because you're totally immersed in it. And when I was going bananas in my writing room, I thought of you, and your spirit helped us through it. So thank you. So this chapter was basically after the section where I really started to find out about the Gay Liberation Front. I'm what's called a Section 28 baby, which Section 28 was the institutional homophobic legislation brought in by Margaret Thatcher and the Tory government in 1988, which started in 1988 and finished in 2003. And that was the exact time frame that I started school and finished college. And it banned the promotion of homosexuality in public institutions. So United Queerdom is both a celebratory book to pay tribute to the Gay Liberation Front and ACT UP and everyone who stands and organises in the principles of absolute freedom for all, but it's also a revenge book against Thatcher's government and Section 28. So this bit of writing was when I really started to find out more about Section 28. Throughout this time, I was incessantly digging, hungry from the pit of my stomach for a life denied. When I found Gays the Word bookshop in London, through watching the film Pride and found books about Section 28, I became angrier by the second. Here, read Blowing the Lid, Gay Liberation, Sexual Revolution and Radical Queens. It is a first-hand account by Stuart Feather, said Uli, with a twinkle in his eye. I think you will like it. Oh, hello. 5 minutes later, by a tree in the sun in Russell Square, it was time to get stuck in. And I dived straight into the iconic GLF demands, first written in 1971. Yeah. These demands: number one, that all discrimination against gay people, male and female, by the law, by employers, and by society at large, should end. Number two, that all people who feel attracted to a member of their own sex be taught that such feelings are perfectly valid. Number three, that sex education in schools stops being exclusively heterosexual. Number four, that psychiatrists stop treating homosexuality as though it were a sickness, thereby giving gay people senseless guilt complexes. Number five, that gay people be as legally free to contact other people through newspaper ads, on the streets, and by any other means they may want, as are heterosexuals, and that police harassment should cease right now. Number six, that employers should no longer be allowed to discriminate against anyone on account of their sexual preferences. Number seven, that the age of consent for gay males be reduced to the same as for straight. And number eight, that gay people be free to hold hands and kiss in public, as are heterosexuals. It seems that so many of the issues 50 years later are as oppressive as they were before. Rushing home, I couldn't wait to explore more. And what struck me most was this: free our heads. The starting point of our liberation must be to rid ourselves of the oppression which lies in the head of every one of us. This means freeing our heads from self-oppression and male chauvinism, and no longer organising our lives according to the patterns with which we are indoctrinated by straight society. It means that we must root out the idea that homosexuality is bad, sick, or immoral, and develop a gay pride. The aim is to step outside the experience permitted by straight society and to learn to love and trust one another. This is the precondition for acting and struggling together. The next day, I took Stuart's book to my local, the Joiners Arms pub on Hackney Road in East London. By night, it was a delicious, wild, anarchic queer rave, and by day, a pioneering, filthy and gorgeous haven for London's misfits and deviants that set the standard by initiating London's first living wage in pubs in London. We got wind that it was soon to be shut down by London's luxury property developers. Is it true? A few of us firm Joiners fans asked its legendary mischievous landlord David Pollard. Newly inspired by Stuart's book and chewing on the words "free our heads," I was adamant. I knew something had to be done, that something could be done. A University College London report by Urban Labs had recently been released that was documenting the closure of marginalised spaces and the resurgence in London's queer communities in response. Between 2006 and 2017, the number of LGBTQIA+ clubs, bars and performance spaces in London plunged from 121 to 51, and many more of the smaller queer venues too. London's queer community now faced total erasure. Once the joiners closed, we realised just how serious an issue this had become. If it could happen somewhere so in demand, it could happen anywhere. Even the most commercially viable bars, some open since the 60s, have succumbed to the ominous knell of gentrification. Legendary ACT UP activist and author Sarah Schulman, who defines the processes of gentrification in her book, The Gentrification of the Mind, so clearly says this: "To me, the literal experience of gentrification is a concrete replacement process. Physically, it is an urban phenomenon. The removal of communities of diverse classes, ethnicities, races, sexualities, languages, and points of view from the central neighbourhood of cities, and their replacement by more homogenised groups. With this comes the destruction of culture and relationship, and this has profound consequences for the future lives of cities. As it stands, anything independent and in the heart of the capital is just keeping the space warm for yet another chain bar or the next batch of designer flats. Space is essential to understanding queer freedom, not just at Pride once a year in central London, but 365 days a year in all our neighbourhoods. Understanding ourselves is essential to our growth." We needed to politicise our world on our own terms. From one conversation in the smokers area, it emerged that we want to do something more than just firefighting the closure of queer spaces. We wanted to celebrate giants like the Gay Liberation Front. And so Queer Tours of London and Mints Through Time was born, a tour project that, against the mass backdrop of the closure of queer spaces, supports London's queer activism, culture and performance in all of its glory. All very well, but I didn't know any elders to ask. On the off chance, I emailed the book's author, Stuart, because God loves a trier. We met a week later and the roller coaster began. With razor-sharp wit and an uncompromising, defiant attitude dripping from every word, we hit it off immediately and responded to an artist's call out to put our intentions into action. That winter, the National Archives planned to take over Soho's recreated Caravan Club. The original Caravan Club was invaded and torn apart by police disgusted by rotten sissies. The owners received years of hard labour. The event we were planning was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Sexual Offences Act in 2017, which led to the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality. Stuart and the GLF were part of the movement that made it happen. We decided to call the open mic cabaret night Auntie Sharon, a symbolic name that pays a tribute to all the queer people in our family tree who went missing and their stories left untold. To name, recognise and acknowledge all our queer ancestors electrocuted, beaten and killed before this legislative change 50 years ago. A few months later, on a windy December evening, 100 people gathered on the cobbled streets of Covent Garden in central London in a wild array of colour. Everyone was clutching a personal item, a photo, a piece of clothing, a flower. Auntie Sharon, the open mic cabaret, was about to begin. We asked people to come with an image of someone personal or unknown, to contribute to a collective statue to those who have made us who we are today, in an act of collective consciousness and a ritual of grief and celebration never seen before. Cramped in the caravan and interior, it is easy to imagine the fog of smoke and queer bodies which fill the tiny private members club. The bar's exterior was covered in blown up 1930s police reports and scandalised letters of complaint from undercover police, seeing sexual perverts, lesbians and sodomites dancing very close together and wriggling their posteriors. At gay clubs then and now, sex, drugs and swing have always mingled with grief. We started the night playing the song Fuck the Pain Away, as my mind tingled back to stomping the dance floors in clubs around the corner as a teenager. As the song faded, one another, guests young and old, recalled predecessors thrown in jail, beaten to death and consumed by AIDS. Waves of goosebumps passed through the room as one by one the audience stood at the queer grief altar at the front to share their loss. Greg, just tell me when I've got like 5 minutes left, because I've got like just one page left. I don't know what's worse, being explicitly targeted as a gay man or invisibilized out of existence as lesbian or trans. Shared an older glamorous lady, followed quickly by a wild-eyed, nervous, but striking young man who trembled as he recalled coming out to his father the previous week. Lindsay then came bounding to the stage, an activist from Lesbian and Gay Support the Migrants, a movement inspired by Mark Ashton and Lesbian and Gay Support the Minors in the 1980s. Right now, multiple queer women are trapped in Yarlswood Detention Centre, facing deportation back to face violence and persecution in Commonwealth countries. She breaks off. At the last anti-deportation centre demonstration, I was trying to see their eyes, but I couldn't reach them. I couldn't talk to them. I couldn't hold them. All I could connect with were the tissues they were waving behind the prison bars, said Lindsay as she held her heart and found her chair. Kat Kai Kolkes then came out, sparkling in a shimmering black outfit from behind the curtain, and got ready to perform a song from her musical. It was a tribute to American Matthew Shepard, who was battered to death aged 22 in 1998, that sparked a global movement against LGBTQIA+ hate crime. After the song, she said, "I spent years wondering if I should step in front of a bus." She slowly pronounced giving each word its own stage, or if it's better than being tied to a post and beaten to death, giving the audience a knowing hug with her eyes as she stepped down. Next up came Nell, with fiery red hair and a floor-length sequin dress, who opened their lungs and embraced the room. Our entire queer culture is perceived by the outside world as being about getting screwed, high, or exploited, or being promiscuous in one sense or another. But there's so much more to that than being queer. It's about being together, being free. One speaker to go, and I winked at Andrew Lumsden, that it was his time to stand up. In 1970, Andrew was a journalist at the Times in Fleet Street. The first demo for the GLF was in Highbury Fields on the 27th of November that year. And Andrew read about and thought, I've got to get down there, and join the GLF the following Wednesday. He suggested that the country needed an LGBT newspaper and urged it to be called Gay News. Gay then being the defiant new term covering all genders and all queers. It became the first legal LGBT+ paper since partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967. He knew about the homophobic persecution Auntie Sharon brought to life that night, as he recalled 1960s gay clubs where you were not allowed to touch while dancing. He and the GLF were hounded by police for their radical drag stunts and dressing up as nuns, shutting down queerphobic religious festivals and bookstores selling materials that medicalised homosexuality as a sin. Creating radical drag communes, underground queer literature networks, and gay days in public parks, the GLF urged the queer community to unite around a simple set of demands. Self-made pamphlets, zines, and newsletters were the DIY vehicles that helped forge solidarity of thought, galvanizing citizens who refused to remain silent, and ultimately propelling forward the movement for the emancipation of queer people. These called for an end to decriminalisation against homosexuals in employment and sex education, and confronted the equal age of consent and the pathologisation of sexual and queer difference by the medical establishment. Last couple of paragraphs. He left the crowd stunned. As whiskered waiters sashayed through the packed crowd, a cheer rose as he invited everyone to pick a stone. Things have changed, he said. This event is commemorating the 50th anniversary of partial decriminalisation in 1967. Our aim at GLF has and will always be absolute freedom for all, dead or alive, so we demand an apology from the Queen for gay persecutions. Pardons? Pah! We'll issue any pardons when we feel like it. As we stepped back into the smoky night air, everyone was grateful to be able to touch one another, to hold hands in the street and to talk. Andrew asked everyone to pick up a stone, each stone symbolising a lost queer ancestor, and walk in the London moonlight to drop them in the Thames River. The tide was out. Everyone braved the slippery steps to throw our stones to the riverbank shore, where so many sex workers and queers have drowned, vanished, committed suicide, or murdered, to remember those who can speak no longer. It was time to make a line in the sand. Then I have a box at the end of each chapter with a little toolkit. This one being harnessing grief as a tool for transformation, how to organise a grief ritual, which I learned from ACT UP with the Ashes Action in 1992 from the film. Obviously I wasn't there. Number one, welcome in grief as a positive force for change. Number two, balance the head, intellect, the heart, emotions, and hand actions. Number 3, explore the depths and breadth of grief's alchemical powers. Number 4, ask questions. What has been lost? Where can grief take us? And I also learned that from the book Act Up Emotions. Number 5, explore how ritual and memorial brings closure. One of the greatest challenges is our belief that we need leaders. We ourselves have everything we need to create beauty and dignity in this world. Let's start by looking in the mirror and at each other. Question everything. Asking questions cultivates curiosity, which leads to change in the mind, the heart, and our actions, and ultimately the status quo. Central to the journey towards emancipation from perpetual warfare is love. In order to walk the tightrope in freeing ourselves from trauma through the practice of love, we must understand that hope is paradoxical. Hope is neither passive waiting nor is it unrealistic forcing of circumstances that cannot occur. It is like the crouched tiger, which will only jump when the moment for realization has come. To hope means to be ready at every moment for that which is not yet born. With their words and actions, movements like the Stonewall uprisings, Never Going Underground, the anti-Section 28 movement here in the UK, ACT UP and the GLF have helped us move from emotional slavery to liberation. The question now is, how do we interpret these movements in the ongoing struggle for freedom today? And I finish with a quote. We need more light about each other. Light creates understanding, understanding creates love, love creates patience, and patience creates unity, by Malcolm X, American Muslim minister and civil rights activist. There we go. Oh, thank you. Oh. Oh, Greg, shall I?
So, who shall I unmute?
Stuart, the
All
amazing Stuart.
Cool.
Stuart.
Okay, I'm here.
Yay.
All right, you want me to talk about the Gay Liberation Front in London. There were two young 20-year-old sociology students who had read in the newspapers about little snippets of stuff in the Times and other British newspapers about the beginning of a gay liberation front in New York. I saw one too, and I couldn't understand what gay liberation meant at all. I was really puzzled by it. I thought about it quite a bit. Anyway, Bob Mellors and Aubrey Water, who didn't know each other at the time, the sociology students, went to America in 1970. Bob landed in New York and joined the Gay Liberation Front there in the city. And Aubrey went on a tour of America, got as far as San Francisco, stayed in a commune where Constantine Berland was living, and then came back to the East Coast. They met up at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Conference in Philadelphia in August that year, and decided that when they got back to London, they would start their own Gay Liberation Front in the UK. Bob, being a sociology student at the LSE, decided to book a room and launch the first meeting. They thought they were just going to be appealing to students. In fact, that's all they were interested in, was forming a party of gay students. But in the second meeting, lots of lesbians came along, lots of queers from the bars, and they were taken completely by surprise. Nevertheless, they agreed to go out leafleting the following week, and two friends of mine who were out shopping on Oxford Street had a leaflet thrust into their hand, and when I saw them, they said, "Oh, we're going to the Gay Liberation Front next week." Well, that rang bells, but I couldn't quite figure it out. But along we went. And I was asked in that meeting, well, we were all asked in that meeting to look at the way we behaved at work and how we disguised our sexuality. And I saw in front of my eyes all the games that I played to sort of hide my gayness. And I was mortified and rather disgusted by it. And so so Gay Liberation had an immediate appeal for me. My two friends couldn't stand it and never came back. And I never really saw them much again, but that was fine by me. I joined the Gay Liberation Front Straighteth group when it was founded a few months later, and our first real political theatre piece, a demonstration, we got together outside Bow Street Magistrates Court in support of the women from Women's Lib who had been arrested for disrupting the Miss World contest. And we had a show called the Miss Trial Competition. And I appeared in drag for the first time. And that became a revelation for me. I sensed the power of drag and the whole gender bending experience. So that became my base within GLF for the rest of its existence. Beyond that, I met up with other people who began thinking like I did, that, GLF, in GLF, there was just a multiplicity of questions we were asking ourselves. Questions about our sexuality, of course, questions about what is about my nature, what kind of homophobic person am I? What is gay in me and what is misogynistic? And slowly, I and my friends started to dress in drag, and that was really very enlightening, because just the discomfort, in a way, of women's clothes, the tightness of it, and the heels and everything, it made one feel really kind of vulnerable, and in a way, a vulnerability that women perhaps themselves wouldn't notice because they grew up with it, but for us, it was a really telling experience. And we went on to use drag. We became notorious, of course, because the men were disgusted by our behavior. They thought we were letting the side down, and we were really vilified. But that was fine. We developed our own ideas on femininity, and we supported the women completely. And we formed our own gay communes in Notting Hill Gate. And really we were following willy-nilly. Nothing of this was really planned or thought out, but willy-nilly. We ended up living in a commune. We shared everything, our money, our possessions, our clothes, and occasionally we attempted to share our bodies. That didn't always work, but we made the attempt anyway. And that lasted for about 18 months. There was also 2 women in our commune, straight women, and 2 children, an infant of a baby of 13 months and an infant who was 3.5 years old. And I think the difference between GLF in London and GLF in New York is maybe the fact that socialism wasn't a dirty word for us. And so we were perhaps more into political analysis from a sort of socialist point of view. There were many Marxist socialists within the movement, and also, well, Aubrey himself, the co-founder, and his boyfriend were Maoists, and there were some sort of closet international socialists and people like that. Well, that's a rough summary of the difference between London and New York. I think that's, I don't know what else I can add to that, really.
That's marvellous. Wow. How many are we? Sorry.
Did you have a question, Andrea?
No, I was just wondering how many people are here now.
Ah, yeah. How many have we got, Greg? Oh, you're on mute.
It doesn't matter. It's not relevant. It was very moving, all that.
Sorry, 26.
How many, Greg?
26.
Amazing. Thank you. Can I just say something, Greg, quickly?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stuart. I have a question, but just to update everyone who's joined recently about the structure of this evening. We had an intro from Greg, and then we had Stuart, one of the original activists from the Gay Liberation Front. And we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Gay Liberation Front this year. Then we've got Jason after that next. And I'll just give a quick intro. Your bug fee is amazing. A nationally recognised, I mean, you all know, you probably know each other, but is a nationally recognised activist organising within the Centre of Black Queer Liberation. Formerly from Vocal New York, Jason gained his notoriety by bringing together thousands of New Yorkers living with HIV to pass city and state laws and to influence federal policies. Jason, there's so much more, but Jason's devotion to social justice work extends prior to joining Vocal's team. He began organising as a student at the University of Louisville, probably not saying that right, serving as president of NAACP, co-chair of the Student National Coordinating Committee, co-founder of Blackout, the first LGBTQ recognised student organisation for people of colour in the state of Kentucky. In 2012, following the murder of Trayvon Martin, Jason was leading organiser in a citywide solidarity rally, which led to the creation of Louisville for Trayvon. Now, am I saying Louisville right? Chapter of Black Lives Matter. So much.
The way they pronounce it is Louisville. They pronounce it Louisville.
Louisville. Oh wow. Oh wow. I need to brush up on my accents. Thank you. And then we're also going to hear from my dear friend Sunitha, who is in London here with me, who probably see that banner behind my head, was one of the key organisers in Queer Night Pride, a QTBOC and LGBTQ, and Sunitha organised the QTBOC and LGBT plus Black and People of Colour block. And Queer Night Pride is a movement challenging the recent rise in LGBT hate crime. Sunitha grew up around her mum's family where politics about Sri Lanka were constantly being discussed and was recently prompted to campaign for Labour in the last election because of her difficult experiences as an Asian person in queer spaces and wider society. Sunitha is also part of the Riposte Nightclub Collective, one of London's leading queer techno art movements. And so yeah, if any of you ever come to London, do let's go dancing together. And then to Sarah Schulman, whose work as, he's going to do the Q&A after, whose work as a novelist, non-fiction writer, playwright, screenwriter, and AIDS historian is devoted to social change and to the making of more livable socially, economically, political lives. Her most famous work includes The Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to a Lost Imagination, which is here, and Israel-Palestine and the Queer International, both of which foreground the relevance of gender sexual politics in understanding and challenging violent socio-political systems, the former through a history of AIDS and gentrification in New York, the latter through an exploration of the role of pinkwashing and homonationalism in the continued occupation of Palestinian territories. Schulman is and has always been a passionate activist and campaigner, member of the international direct action group ACT-UP, founder of the ACT-UP Oral History Project and co-founder of the Lesbian Avengers. Sarah blends her intellectual and political endeavours in a way which provides as much space for an interrogation of multiple systems of oppression as it does for their ultimate destitution. And then lastly, before we go over to you, Jason, I just wanted to say that thank you again, Greg, from the Bureau of General Services Queer Division and the LGBT Community Centre. If you're not already actively involved, this is more really to non-Americans watching this. If there's any way that we can support the services and the centre through blogs, through promotion of anything you're doing, of course we will. And all of the donations for tonight's discussion go to Black Lives Matter, and really, you know, to pay tribute to the roots of the Gay Liberation Front, which is from the Black Power and Women's Liberation movements in America. I'll shut up now because I really want to hear from you, Jason. But yeah, I just wanted to welcome everyone, especially people who just came.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, first just want to show appreciation and gratitude for being a part of such a wonderful and esteemed panel. As someone who has always kind of identified as, I identify as like as a butch queen, right? Using like Black queer vernacular when we talk about ourselves, and started to understand what it meant to be a gay man, to a butch queen, to being queer, has been an evolution of kind of like thought and thinking as we start to kind of like conceptualize, as I start to, because of like my experience in this world. So I think I'll talk a little bit about my history and talk about like BLM movement and how that intersects with kind of like queer liberation. I grew up in social justice organizing. My grandfather was the first Black council member in Kingston, New York, fighting against urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, which essentially is what we call like gentrification, right? So like folks were going in and doing urban renewal in downtown Kingston, where a lot of Black communities live, were facing being pushed out, and my grandfather helped stop that. My mother moved to DC to keep us connected to movement work. And yeah, so I grew up in Washington, DC, really coming from a Black liberatory experience, rooted in kind of like Black liberation theology, right? So like the theology was rooted in that, like this idea of God that is rooted in whiteness cannot exist if we dream of ourselves to be liberated. So I come from I identify also as a Pan-Africanist, understanding that the liberation of Black folks is a global experience, right? That Black people are folks of African descent, are experiencing experiencing the same structures of white supremacy and whiteness and colonization, and also like capitalism that also like is turning like African nations. So I also identify as a Pan-Africanist. So a lot of my movement work started as a debater. I was a debate nerd in high school, and actually was debating started my journey in activism, in organizing, doing debate work, where we started to challenge the notion that knowledge production exists at the ivory tower, right? That knowledge production and understanding where knowledge can generate also comes from the grassroots, also comes from people lived experiences, also comes from community. The ivory tower is not the end all and be all when it comes to understanding or conceptualizing where knowledge is produced and found. So we did that through a Black performance, a hip hop critique. So I started playing hip hop as being my knowledge. Like, how do we talk about poverty? How do we talk about colonialism? How do we talk about oppression that happens in our community from folks who actually experience their oppression and who are able to articulate it through our cultural performance, which that time for me as a hip hop head was hip hop. When I went to the University of Louisville, that's when I started to get more politically activated and really started to organizing as the NAACP and doing work with Gina 6. So a little bit of history. So like Black folks have been fighting for liberation and their freedom since like colonization, right? So like ever since like Europeans came into the shores, like we've been fighting against like the objectification of our bodies, the stealing of our material resources, and the objectification of our people. You even see that as far as just like straight up like fighting to like even suicide, where folks were hopping off of the enslaved ships and killing themselves as an act of revolution and as an act of resistance. Even on the plantations, you'll see various forms of resistance, whether it was very small things as like making sure that you could break the equipment so that you couldn't work, right? Or running away, or like playing sick. There were different forms in which folks, African descent or enslaved Africans, resisted white supremacy and oppression, and ultimately policing, right? Because we were surveilled to do work, and if we did not do work, we will get in trouble, right? So that's the system, and that's the system of policing that we still exist, right? That a system of policing of Black folks or folks of African descent. There, I'm jumping around a lot because there's a lot of Blackness. Okay, so with that, so now fast forwarding to my experience in the University of Louisville, I started organizing around Black liberation with Gina 6. So back in 2008, 6 Black students, kids, high schoolers, in Gina, Louisiana, some other kids, white kids, hung a noose on a tree, and the Black kids didn't think it was funny, and they proceeded to jump the kids. And that created like a big thing where the kids were being tried as an adult. They was charged with attempted murder. The weapon was a shoe. And it was just literally throwing the book at kids over a hyper-racialized incident. At this time, this was before like we had social media like that. Facebook was just starting to like pop off. All we had really was kind of like our music and hip hop. So with that, Mos Def gave the call, and a lot of hip hop artists. This was when Kanye was the college dropout Kanye. This was when we had Common, Mos Def. This is like that era of like radical hip hop. You're talking about Boondocks, Aaron Magruder. We're talking about like that lineage of folks back in kind of like 2005, 2006, up into that era. They gave a call and asked students to walk out. It was like blackout, walk out. And then we all walked out for Gina 6, and it became like a hip hop phenomenon. And then like the charges would drop. Then you fast forward to 2012. That's when you will see Trayvon Martin getting murdered. So a lot of the activation from Black Lives Matter to even Black liberation work has always centered on young people. It always centered on like young queer folks in particular. You see the founding of Black Lives Matter today with Black lesbians who are like leading the charge in this. So I think like one of the things that's also very interesting. I'm jumping around a lot. But one of the things I think is also very interesting about like the moment that we're in is that Black queer folks have always sit at the intersection of doing double work, of like working to ensure that our queerness is liberated at the same time that our Blackness is liberated, right? We see that intersection play with Marsha P. Johnson. We see that intersection play with Bayard Rustin, one of the architects and engineers of the March on Washington, the person who taught Martin Luther King nonviolence protests, and essentially Martin Luther King was told to separate from Bayard Rustin because of his queerness. It was actually a politician in New York that pretty much said that like, hey, if you don't separate, I'm gonna tell the world y'all fucking, right? It was essentially like that. It was essentially like, you know, like to get them to separate from the movement. So, you know, that's real, right? There's like real attempts to divide Black queer folks who sit at the intersection of the Blackness and queerness, and the work that we're doing to liberate all of us. That work has been historic, that labor has been historic, and that oppression is also, unfortunately, historic. So yeah, so with that, like, we're at another iteration where we're starting to see that a little bit again, right? I think like we're seeing, though, something that we haven't seen before in the past, of queer folks, particularly Black trans women, actually speaking up in volume and saying like, no, we're not doing this again, right? No, we're going to ensure that there's not going to be this erasure, that we're going to be front and center, and community, not only just white allies and accomplices, queer folks, trans folks, are centering on Black trans women in particular and lifting them up at this moment, because that work is the critical work of the intersection. For just like radical feminist liberatory work. So that's kind of like what the work is happening on the ground. I'm kind of like all over the place because I'm like organizing mine too, because I'm organizing a protest tomorrow for Trans Day Action. We're actually doing this intersection work. We're having the house and ballroom community come to the Occupy that's happening in Manhattan tomorrow to actually do just that, to make sure that we elevate Black and brown queer folks at this time, so that we can do the shared work, which I find a joyous work of our collective liberation. Dan, one of the things I do, and kind of like my wrap-up remarks, like you have like almost like got me to a place of like tears, because, you know, we hear a lot, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. And when you talked about the gentrification of clubs, right, that is actually happening in Black club spaces in this country, right? Except for Atlanta, right? But in New York and in DC in particular, like the erasure of like Black clubs, how difficult it is for Black promoters to have space to have Black parties. I come from a city, Washington, DC, where we could probably say we hosted the first Black Pride, right? The first Black Gay Pride, right? There is this erasure, so you got me to a place where I'm like, damn, our community is experiencing that too. Bed-Stuy, historic Black gay community, right? We lost the club Langston's. That was the place for us, not to just say that Black Lives Matter, but Black joy matters, right? So for me, when I hear a lot around like Black Lives Matter, and we say it so much, I'm like, yeah, but what's Black life without Black joy? You know? So where is the joy? And for me, you know, as a Black queer person, like I found my joy in our pride, right? I found my joy in my ability to like walk out and be in the world and be unafraid and unashamed of my fabulosity, right? So like, I think that like, you know, I think like the next frontier, the way we can deepen and expand and actually bring more life into what like Black Lives Matter is like, how do we find and access and amplify Black joy? How do we also help to invest in Black nightlife, Black queer nightlife again? What does that look like? How do we ensure that Black trans women can walk down the street joyfully? It's like those experiences, like how we can move and exist and be in the world is key to Black life. If there's no joy for me, then what is joy without life, right? So like that's kind of like where, you know, I'm finding the what I call the greater work, right? The greatest work is like, hey, how do we do the work together where we can find joy in our common struggle, in our common work and pursuit for liberation? How can we find the joy to access that? And I find that to be the most empowering and invigorating tool that will further and keep us consistent in our pursuit for liberation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. We'll come back to that question after, huh? In the pursuit for Black joy and queer liberation and all the intersections within it. Thank you so much. God, you've got a busy next few days. Let's talk more about how we can all support as well. Thank you. Sunitha, should we go over to you, my love?
Hi. Yeah, so I can't even remember how I know Dan, but probably through a lot of queer spaces and meeting him and different friendship groups. And I'm so glad that he asked me to speak today. It's very late, so bear with me, but yeah. So for me, I think it's quite interesting. Like, I think in terms of my queerness, it's something that's always been there and present, but to be able to have the language to explain it is probably something that's only happened in the last few years. And being able to kind of acknowledge that in like a real way is obviously more complex, being from the background I am from. And I think that makes it a very complicated kind of concept to deal with. You know, when I arrived in queer spaces, it was like coming home almost. You know, I knew what I was, but I didn't feel the need to be in the spaces. So like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when I went to parties and I met people that were like me, I felt like I was coming home to something that I was missing my whole life. And, you know, through that kind of time, I've met amazing people, you know, Dan is one of them, and it has been an incredible experience. And yeah, I've always found it very difficult because sometimes I'll go to spaces and I am a minority within that space, and I find it very difficult, particularly like the music I listen to. It's not necessarily music that people who are of my colour will go and party to. And through like very interesting conversations with other people, I've kind of found people like me, I guess, who understand that it's not just about having a party that is, you know, let's go and have fun. Okay, it's very important to have that, of course it is. But for when you're a minority within a minority and having that kind of intersectionality, it's really important to feel like you're welcome there. And that's kind of like where Repost Collective kind of came from. We were all friends that had met at parties. We like kind of loved that sort of space, and it was about, for us, creating somewhere that we all felt safe and we all felt like we could be, and not just, you know, having safer space policies just for the sake of it. It's not you know, just paying lip service, but actually making people think about, not everybody wants to be touched, not everybody, you know, wants to have you turn up and say, oh, you're so exotic or something like that. It's really important to sort of respect people and understand that people want to have other representation. They don't want to just be the only person in the room that looks different. And it is difficult because, you know, it's not that people are conscious of doing it. I think I've never felt like people didn't want me to be in spaces like that, but it really kind of showed the value for me of, you know, within my family and my community, I don't feel like I'm that represented. There aren't people who are queer and out in the same way. Even for me, it's only within certain spaces with my family that I can be like that. Equally, for some people, like I mean, I spoke to friends recently, and being able to be like running an event is really important for me. I know I don't necessarily understand the optics, but for some people it's really important to see someone that looks like me running an event. I've not been to an event before where that happens, unless it's specifically designed for South Asian communities. And you know, I have been to those events and they're great, but I also want to be an event where there are people of every background and be able to mix and integrate and discuss things and have topics that are maybe not the most exciting to be having on a dance floor about racism and colorism and all these other topics that affects us on a daily basis. And for me, like, that's why I love Repulsed. It's about making those kind of awareness of how different people experience being in queer spaces, that it isn't automatically a natural space to be in for everyone. And yeah, so that for me has become, obviously during this time, it's been quite different, but it's been something that's really important to me. And it's also made me sort of hyper aware of how, you know, there is still certain aspects that maybe I don't get from being in queer spaces, and things like around like wholesomeness, and trying to create a space that integrates like the wholesomeness that I grew up with, of like gathering around with my family, having food, and that being a huge part about my culture, but also having the aspects that I love about queer spaces, about, you know, and the energy and like the vibrance that comes with that. So I still, you know, as much as there has been progress, I still think there's still like a space to go. And like with Jan organising Queer Night Pride, being part of that was an incredible experience. Just what happened and how we felt in that space was, you know, it kind of happened around a drag queen had got attacked quite severely and beaten up opposite a pub that's renowned for being like a safe space for people, and it was a horribly violent attack. And I don't think anyone, we all know these things have been like happening in the UK. There's been a rise in like LGBT hate crime and also racism, and especially after like Brexit and things, that has really it's kind of emboldened people. And for me, it was amazing to see how many people came, even though it was freezing cold and people weren't really sure what was happening, but the energy and how everyone felt was really special. And lots of people had not really experienced that kind of energy in their, you know, most people were all sorts of ages, but mostly people had, I guess, taken their security for granted, taken the fact that they can kind of, they live in their kind of queer bubble in maybe like East London, and they can kind of be how they want to be. I think it was about acknowledging that not everyone is able to just wander around London, especially if you're traveling at night, and, you know, having to make those changes of like, let's put some clothes on so that we kind of can pass as straight, so we don't have to deal with, you know, having to be visible and dealing with issues when we travel on public transport or whatever it is. And I think it was, you know, it was unexpected how much like energy we all felt in that space. And I think Dan will agree that we were so, like, everyone was like reinvigorated that we can, you know, we can make these efforts, and we have a lot of enthusiasm to make these changes in our society, I guess. And it's you know, it's also about acknowledging that it's about for everyone, it's about that inclusivity and like raising like the you know, everyone to the same level. It's not about, okay, well, we've got what we need to do to be able to integrate in society. And you have it a lot in the UK of like, a lot of people don't see it as their struggle, but it's for everyone to be involved and to take that responsibility. And I think at the moment, with what's been happening with Black Lives Matter, I think a lot of people are having to have difficult conversations about race and by extension these things around like queerness and activism need to be part of those things, and it's coming from all sorts of spaces. And I think people are being aware of what privilege they have, but it is still difficult to have those conversations, and it can be exhausting. And I think we also have to acknowledge about how a lot of my friends right now aren't able to take that energy, because this is going to be a long struggle, and we can see how things have changed in the US and in the UK in the last 5 to 10 years, that it is going to take a lot of energy. But I think at the same time, I've met so many people with that like level of enthusiasm, and people like Dan, and having this kind of platform has been amazing. But yeah, I'm just kind of rambling now.
Thank you, Sunitha. Thank you so much. Wow.
Time for Q&A now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Sunitha. Thank you, Jason, Dan. Thank you, Stuart. So I just want to ask one big question, see if anybody has any answers, and then we'll go to whatever people are writing in the chat. So we're at a time of tremendous change. It's very dangerous, and there's a lot of potential. We have a huge movement. From a queer perspective now, queer people are in leadership of every progressive movement. It's not like you need a separate queer movement in the same way. So that kind of representation is very different. Everyone is being asked to and is understanding that Black lives need to be centered, and in whatever kind of a movement working that we're doing, and that even though it's a very big tent. But we're also at a time of huge unemployment. We're all at risk medically. We don't even understand this virus or where it's going. So much has been stolen and looted by our current regimes in both the UK and the United States. And there's a rise of fascism and violence, racist violence. So we're at a very, very dangerous time, but we have this enormous movement in the streets that has demands, but how are those demands going to be met exactly? So there's just a lot there. So given all those changes and the history of these movements as they've been articulated just now are really in the past right now. We're really in a new era that's maybe just started in the last few weeks. So what do you see as the most effective, concrete way to go forward towards getting demands met from this new perspective? That is my question. Jason, why don't I start with you, because you're involved with Occupy City Hall, right?
Yeah, so the question is, what is the concrete way to move forward to getting our demands?
Met, yes.
One, sustaining public pressure. We're seeing that public pressure is working. And I will continue and build it. And then this is also election year, and I think we have started, I haven't followed a lot of the returns, but we have seen like a lot of progressive, even kind of like democratic socialist folks in New York City starting to win. So I know that this is an election year also for city council. We're seeing like half of New York City City Council is going to be a huge race next year. And I'm sure every platform will have a Black Lives Matter type of like piece to it. So I think so like there's sustaining public pressure, occupying spaces, and just building on tactics. So like rioting was a tactic that we saw come and go, and now we're seeing like folks like holding space. I mean, elevating kind of like the demand and just holding ground, like kind of like just holding ground. It's also like getting elected award, and I feel like deepening the commitment of allies, right? So whether allies can deepen their commitment and transform into accomplices, beautiful, ideal. If folks are unable to do that work, just deepen their commitment by making very serious commitment and investment towards the movement. That can look like policy, that can look like funding, that could look like creating space and sharing that space or offering that space so voices so that they can be elevated up at this time. I think there's a lot of ways in which we can leverage our resources, our abilities in order to elevate the voices, elevate the voices and the narrative to help sustain this work. A beautiful narrative is being crafted right now. And how do we ensure that we can sustain it and then build upon it and then bring more folks that kind of help amplify the power to it is going to be the critical piece.
Okay, so let me ask Stuart, let me rephrase that for you. What attitude or approach to change from gay liberation past do you think can inform us today and be helpful to us now?
Well, I think the history of how we organized things and I don't really know. It's the production of a manifesto, a set of demands. Well, the demands are out there anyway. That's clear enough. I suppose it depends on what you think is most important. And for me, there's still a lot to do with the things we face as lesbians and gay, LGBTQI plus people altogether. And I suppose if that was on a more solid basis, then we could go out into the rest of the community at large and join and join them in the effort of attempting to change things, like well, supporting BMA, Black Lives Matter, then there's the environment, and the list is pretty large. And I don't know, really, I hadn't thought about that before, and I think you're right, that we are in a new era, and I suppose I'm a bit lost as to what to do next, really.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Let me ask Sunitha, in terms of the things that you concretely need, what do you think is the best, most effective action to get the things the changes that you need?
I think a lot of the time, at least in the context of how I've got into activism, for example, is like I feel like a lot of people from my background, they will get involved with certain things, but I don't know, I think there's a lot of, I don't want to be the person that starts this, or I think there's a lot of like lack of confidence to be taking those leads, especially amongst like South Asian communities, especially in like queer spaces. And it's not that they're not visible and they don't want to be in those spaces, but I think it's quite difficult for, you know, for me even to go and do those things. It's taken me a lot of time and effort to like meet people and work on those type of skills. And I think a lot of people feel like there's a mentality, particularly in certain communities, of I don't want to be the person that rocks the boat. And it's really ingrained that if we just keep our heads down, that it'll be okay, and that we can sort of do like peripheral struggles, but we don't want to be like seen as trying to be aggressive or be causing trouble. And I think it is slowly changing with, you know, younger generations, definitely, but I think that's something that it's something within particularly South Asian communities, at least I've experienced, that people just amongst themselves will discuss racism and will discuss like how they feel uncomfortable maybe in queer spaces and how they want to change things, but there just isn't that like urgency, because they don't feel like they've been lifted up enough. And I think there's definitely, you know, an aspect of, yes, there are obviously lots of people who do a lot of activism within like South Asian communities in queer spaces, but I think it's about supporting them and allowing them to kind of realize they have that voice and that they have that power to do that. Because I think it is particularly, there is a little bit of, I don't know, there just is a little bit of lack of confidence, and possibly just maybe this isn't our fight, or not right now.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Dan, what is the next action you are taking after this event?
Oh, I'm still I'm muted.
No, we can.
You can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Great question, Sarah. I think, by the way, just a little response to, in terms of, I read a really good article the other day by someone you probably know, Matthew Rodriguez, who I think is an ACT UP activist, in response to the pandemic. It's called COVID-19 and HIV are not the same. They're similar in many ways that matter. And it's got some of the best subheadings I've ever read. The penultimate subheading is, our government is a fucking disaster. And then lastly, ACT UP is still responding. I'll share that here. The next action, and this also responds to the question about like creative, effective action. In the book, one of the actions that we document is called the Beyond UKIP Cabaret. And for me, obviously this book as well, Beautiful Trouble, has been, I'm lucky to be a facilitator with them. And one of the techniques is building unexpected allies. And the Beyond UKIP Cabaret, and so this is something we're gonna do a round 2 of after, you know, soon when we strategize it effectively. So that was, for me, my favorite action, and it was effective because it was about building unexpected allies, because the powers that be, they like to compartmentalize us. That's what an anti-racist activist looks like. That's what a queer activist looks like. That's what a feminist looks like, etc. But they don't understand when we look at the intersections and embody that in our actions. And so UKIP, for people who don't know, they're hopefully they're going away now, but they were at least 5 years ago a prominent far-right party, the UK Independence Party. And on every level, they were bigoted, racist, fascist, misogynistic. One of the first actions that we did in ACT UP when we reformed it was dump half a ton of horse shit in front of their offices in South London on World AIDS Day in response to what they said when they said, frankly, the last kind of migrants we should allow into the UK are those living with HIV. So we dumped half a ton of shit on their offices with a banner which says, what goes around comes around, solidarity on World AIDS Day. And they ended up getting kicked out of their offices, which was more than we could have ever asked for. That led on to a cabaret, which in response to your question is something that we want to strategize for our next action now. It'll actually be the 5th anniversary to challenge the multiple oppressions and the isolation that we're facing at the moment. So we wanted to know what to do next because, you know, the things that were coming out of UKIP's mouth were like, the thing about I just said about HIV positive migrants. When Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, was on a train from Manchester to London, he said he didn't like hearing all these international voices. This is not what Britain should be like. When he was late for a meeting in Wales, he blamed traffic on the M4 or on the motorway on migrants. He said breastfeeding mothers should face the wall. The UKIP weather scandal was when gay marriage was introduced, it was bad weather, and they said that's a sign from God, and many other bigoted things. So lots of different grassroots movements got together and we were like, well, what can we do about this? We need to create an action which challenges them on all fronts. And it's the 70th anniversary of the official end of the Nazi Holocaust. And we created a cabaret in tribute to the Weimar era. The queer, you know, very queer influenced Weimar movement of creative expression, and took it to Nigel Farage's pub because at the time he said, I'm a man of the people, come and speak to me in my pub. So we're like, all right, we'll take our cabaret of diversity to your pub and see how you like that. And so we had queer activists dancing at the front of the pub to It's Raining Men. We had breastfeeding mothers out with their boobs at the bar. We had different LGBT migrant groups in fake cars blockading the entrance in a traffic jam. We had my friend Ruth, who's a Holocaust survivor, doing a speech about the parallels of rising fascism then and now. And many other things. Then we ended with a conga line around the pub singing We Are Family. And then he ended up leaving the pub. And that was great. So in response to the question, I think we will be creating another creative cabaret, which both brings our movements together in the best way in terms of COVID, as well as confronting the powers that be, which are at the root of all of our problems.
Okay, thank you. So wait, what else is on our agenda for tonight?
There's a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Why don't you just ask the questions? Yeah.
Yeah, it's from Vicky saying, what, if anything, do you want straight allies to do to support your efforts, in brackets, other than try to not to take over? Straight white allies.
Anyone?
Sunitha's smiling. That means you got a thought. Come on, let's hear it.
So I think, at least with the last couple of weeks, I've heard it a lot where it feels like a lot of people want to take over the conversation around racism, especially from white allies. And I think it's quite interesting how Dan was saying, as people like that, you know, they pick and choose what they want. So they're happy to like enjoy going to like drag performances, but they're not gonna like support actual like struggling queer artists. And they're sort of, I think this is something that we definitely need to understand, like especially when I've done stuff through Repost. We are starting off, but we still find ways to like support our community and like support the artists that are within those communities. And I think that is part of it, is that a lot of queer people, you know, they are surviving, and it's about like, it's not just about standing up. And I think I think a lot of people have seen this with the Black Lives Matter movement. It isn't just about standing out and calling out things, but also these are communities that need finance. Like Queer Night, and a lot of people under COVID are in dire straits. Like there's a welfare system, but without any like way of having a way to live and survive, they are struggling. And it isn't just, and that leads to all sorts of issues. And it is like, I mean, I went to something like maybe 6 months ago, and it was people watching like, you know, watching like RuPaul's Drag Race or something, but like someone talking through it. But most of the crowd was straight white people, and in the other room there was like a similar thing, but it was a live performance, and they wouldn't ever go into that. And those people were struggling and are struggling to like finance their sort of situations. And I think it's also about a lot of people who have been fighting don't want to necessarily have to have these conversations all the time, because this is what they have been doing for a long time. I think it's about like taking time to educate themselves about what's happened, and so it's not for other people to sit there, like the queer people to sit there and educate them, because I think that's exhausting for a lot of people to explain, like, okay, so this is something we've had to learn and understand and educate ourselves to understand where we've come from and the struggles that we've gone through, and now I have to try and explain it to you again. And sometimes it can be quite like, it's not just that it can be painful, I think it can be frustrating when people don't get like the experiences. So I think it's about sort of putting the effort in to recognize that it's not your friend's belief to educate you, and you have to, you know, do the work and be willing to put the work in the long term as well, because it's not like, you know, it's not just a fad. It shouldn't be just like, oh, I want to do this because it's cool now to be involved in these types of movements, and then in like 2 months I'm going to go and just like do something else now. I learn a new hobby. This is like what people have to live with and experience, and I think that's important to acknowledge.
Thank you. Maybe we should end on that, because that's that brings us into the future. So thank you so much, Sunitha. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Stuart. And thank you, Jason. And thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Dan, did you want to say anything else?
Oh, God, you'll be here all night. I've got so many other things I wanted to say. I guess I just had a little response to the question in terms of what can straight allies do to support. I was just going to say, give us your houses, give us your infrastructure, give us all the things that the queer community is marginalised. We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the buildings. One of my other favourite inspirations from America is Housing Works. I think in terms of like a really holistic, powerful, effective movement in terms of HIV, housing for people living with HIV. That's what we need. It's redistributing what we need, really. I guess the last thing I wanted to share was I'm really inspired by Paulo Freire and the Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
I'm literally typing that into the box.
What were you going to say?
I was literally typing that book into the chat.
Oh, which one? Pedagogy of the Oppressed?
Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I was just about to recommend.
Amazing. Why, Jason?
Because oftentimes when I think like, how do white straight folks show up? I'm like, y'all fuck. Because like, I think like one of the things is that like to be like on the intersection of like whiteness and queerness, right, gives you a lens to understand how you show up in the world as the oppressor and how you show up in the world as oppressed, which gives you a critical consciousness to do the work to deconstruct your own oppression. So Pedagogy of Oppressed is a great book to help you understand how to see yourself as the oppressor, as oppressed yourself. So the Pedagogy of Oppressed is a fabulous book that gives you a sense of like, so let's say let's imagine I'm a straight white man, right? How would I know what it means to be an oppressor I mean, how would I know what it means to be oppressed if I'm a straight, rich white man? Never had that experience, right? Pedagogy of the Oppressed will say that your privilege, that essentially like you being set up as the oppressor, oppressor is your oppression. And it gives you that tool to like look at that in that way so you could start dismantling that work. So for me, like one of the things I also challenge folks is around this idea around privilege, right? It's like privilege is something we should discuss a lot more of, and like how we understand it and evolve our thinking around privilege. For me, we should probably use a different term, because for me, a cis white straight man is privilege, but what that privilege manifests means that you are you share less compassion towards my suffering, right? That privilege separates you from the realities of what's happening with my community, so the compassion doesn't necessarily flow. So people talk about like white privilege, I'm privileged, so I don't have to deal with these things. Yes, that also means that you don't experience the same oppression, which probably means you won't relate to it unless you look at your privilege as a disadvantage in ways. So I think like there's ways in which we can shift some of the language that we use to understand power, privilege, oppression, and those dynamics, to actually start to dismantling those in real ways. But Paulo Freire is a great start to that work.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yeah, we clearly have more conversations to be had. So thank you so much, Sarah. Good luck with the demonstrations coming up. Let's have these like regular transatlantic strategy, celebration, joyous sessions.
Yeah, speaking of which, on Sunday, anyone who's in New York, I hope you'll be at the Queer Liberation March, which started last year in response to the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, and being, so many of us were deeply upset by how Heritage of Pride, which runs the Pride corporation, runs the whole celebration and what it's become. So the Queer Liberation March started last year by Reclaim Pride Coalition, and they're going to have another march this year. This time it's not, there's no police permit, so we're just doing it, which is exciting. So I hope people will join. They're asking people to meet at 12:45 p.m. at Foley Square, downtown. I'm not sure if we have a destination yet. I think it was going to be Washington Square or the Piers, but we'll be posting on the Bureau's website and social media. We'll post more information about that, and I hope people will join if you are able to come out right now. I know not everyone is, but I think it's a really exciting time to see all these movements coming together and being joyous together as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully see you on your side of the pond sooner. If you're here, get in touch with Sunitha, Stuart, Andrea, Nettie, and me.
Yay, definitely. Thanks,
Thank
everyone,
you
for joining. I hope we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.